In 2008, Honda did something it almost never does. It took the formula behind the most produced motor vehicle in history, the tiny Super Cub, more than 100 million built, and tried the same trick on a big, fast, grown-up motorcycle. The bike was the DN01. There was no clutch, no gear lever, and a price of around $15,000, which was more than a lot of the cars parked outside the dealership. Honda had spent 3 years taking it from concept to showroom, and then it landed and it flopped so hard it was gone in about 2. Now here's the part that makes this more than a story about a weird bike nobody bought. The exact thing people mocked the DN01 for, an automatic gearbox on a serious motorcycle, is now sitting on some of Honda's most important and popular big bikes. So Honda wasn't wrong about where riding was heading. Riders really would come around to clutchless big bikes. It just took years. And the DN01 turned out to be the wrong bike at the wrong price to be the one that got them there. So how do you build the future, put it on a showroom floor, and then watch almost nobody want it? The answer starts on a stage in October of 2005. Honda wheels something out at the Tokyo Motor Show that doesn't quite look like anything else in the building. It's long and low and swept back, part cruiser, part sport bike, part spaceship. They call it the DN01. At first, Honda says the name means dream new, with the 01 marking the first machine in a whole new family. By the time the production bike arrives a few years later, Honda is describing those same 2 letters as discovery of a new concept. Even the name hadn't quite settled down. Honda's whole motorcycle stand that year carried the hopeful theme Dream Wings, and this strange machine fit that future-facing message perfectly. The thinking behind it was easy to say and very hard to pull off. For as long as anyone could remember, a real motorcycle meant a clutch in your left hand and gears under your left foot. Honda looked at that rule and asked the quiet, slightly radical question this whole story turns on. What if a big bike could be as easy to ride as twisting the throttle on a scooter? It was certainly hard to ignore, and the way it looked would split opinion almost straight away. To some people, the styling was genuinely futuristic. To others, it was just bizarre. Nobody seemed to feel nothing about it, and that was exactly the kind of reaction Honda wanted. Honda would only bet on something this strange for one reason, and it went right back to what the company had always been. This is a company that got rich by selling motorcycles to people who never thought of themselves as motorcyclists. Back in the 1950s, the industry believed bikes were loud, greasy, slightly dangerous machines for a certain kind of man. Honda ignored all of that and built the Super Cub, a friendly little step-through that a shopkeeper or a student or a delivery kid could ride to work without changing their clothes or their whole identity. It worked beyond anyone's wildest guess. The Super Cub became the most produced motor vehicle ever made, well north of 100 million built, and it got there by reaching all the people every other motorcycle company had ignored, and Honda didn't leave that to chance. In 1962, it ran what became one of the most famous ad campaigns the industry has ever seen, built around a single disarming line. You meet the nicest people on a Honda. The ads didn't show leather-clad rebels tearing down a highway. They showed housewives, students, and families, the exact people who had always been told that motorcycles simply weren't for them. It worked because Honda had figured out something its rivals hadn't. The biggest market for motorcycles was never going to be existing riders. It was everyone who had never once considered becoming one. So by the 2000s, Honda had a very particular itch. It had already conquered the small, cheap, easy end of riding. But the big, expensive end of the market still belonged to tradition. If you wanted a proper touring bike or a cruiser, you had to learn the clutch, learn the gears, and accept the whole learning curve that came with them. And in a sense, Honda was reaching back to an idea that had already worked spectacularly once. Make riding easier and see whether easier opens the door to more people. The DN01 was that instinct-made metal aimed at what Honda called the discriminating adult rider. A clutchless big bike might tempt a newcomer who found shifting intimidating. It might just as easily tempt an experienced rider who simply wanted something easier to live with. Honda wasn't entirely sure which, and by the company's own admission later, the whole thing was part hunch and part experiment. That was the dream. Now Honda actually had to build it. And the heart of the whole thing was the gearbox, because that's exactly where the intimidation lives. For a new rider, a real part of the challenge is just the sheer coordination a big bike demands. On a normal bike, your left hand and your left foot are busy the entire time, feathering a clutch, matching the revs, and hunting for the right gear, all while you're trying to watch the road and not drop a very heavy machine at a red light. Honda's answer was a transmission it called the HFT, the human-friendly transmission, and it was genuinely unlike anything else on two wheels. And this is the clever part. Most automatics you already know, in cars and in scooters, use a belt or a torque converter, and they tend to feel soft and disconnected, like the engine is arguing with the back wheel. Honda didn't want that vague rubber band feeling on a machine it was calling a sports cruiser. So it built a hydraulic mechanical system driven by pumped fluid and pistons rather than a belt, and then it did something nobody had pulled off before. It gave that continuously variable transmission a lockup mechanism, so at a steady cruise it could bypass much of the usual hydraulic loss and give the drivetrain a far more direct mechanical connection. Honda claimed it was the first hydraulic mechanical continuously variable transmission in the world to manage that. On paper, it was the best of both worlds, the ease of an automatic with the direct, connected feel of a manual. And it wasn't just one automatic setting either. The rider got a full automatic drive mode for relaxed cruising, a sport mode that held the engine higher in its rev range and responded more sharply, and if you still wanted control, a 6-speed manual mode you flicked through with buttons on the handlebar. There was no clutch lever anywhere, and no gear pedal, just your right wrist, and if you felt like it, your thumb. You physically could not stall it at a junction. You could pull away smoothly on a hill without ever thinking about the bite point. Everything that makes a big motorcycle intimidating to a newcomer, Honda had quietly engineered out of the equation. Wrapped around that transmission was a 680 cubic centimeter V-twin, the same basic engine Honda used in its Trans Alp, tuned here for smooth, easy, low-down power rather than outright speed. It made around 61 horsepower and would run to about 113 miles an hour, which was plenty for the relaxed machine this was meant to be. In America, Honda gave the odd mixture its own label and called it a crossover, though its global material more often described it as a large sports cruiser. Either way, it wasn't quite a cruiser, and it wasn't quite a sport bike. Long, low, clutchless, and unlike anything else in the showroom. On paper, it really did look like the future had arrived. But almost nobody standing in front of that 2005 concept realized the strangest thing about it. Honda hadn't just dreamed up the automatic motorcycle for the DN01. It had been chasing this exact idea for more than 40 years. Rewind all the way to 1962, just a few years after the Super Cub. Honda builds an ambitious, slightly odd scooter called the Juno M85. It's got a flat, boxer twin engine mounted up front, it's wrapped in heavy steel bodywork, and instead of a normal gearbox, it uses an early hydraulic transmission that the rider varied by twisting the left grip. Honda itself would later point to that exact transmission as the direct ancestor of the DN01's HFT. In 1962, a scooter with no conventional clutch and no stepped gearbox was a genuinely radical thing. Honda has always loved building a technological showpiece just to prove that it could, whether the customer asked for it or not, and the Juno was one of the very first. And here's the detail that should stop you in your tracks, knowing where this story is heading. The Juno flopped. The resemblance to the DN01 isn't exact, but it is eerie. The Juno was ambitious and expensive. Its hydraulic transmission never quite delivered the efficiency Honda had hoped for, And the licensing behind it pushed the price up even further, right as Japan's scooter market was beginning to cool. Buyers who just wanted cheap transport took one look and walked away. Honda sold only around 5,880 of these Junos, the M80 and M85 combined, before quietly pulling the plug. But the idea behind it never actually left the building. Honda kept believing that one day the clutch and the gear lever would stop being sacred, and that riders would end up thanking them for it. So the DN01 wasn't a wild swing that came out of nowhere. It was the newest move in an obsession more than 40 years old, finally made possible by decades of progress in electronics and hydraulics. Honda had made a version of this same expensive mistake once before. And now, in 2008, it was setting up to make it all over again, only this time with a far bigger price tag hanging off the front. By the 40th Tokyo Motor Show in 2007, the DN01 was no longer a concept. Honda showed it as a finished production-ready machine, and in 2008 it finally went on sale, first in Japan and Europe, then in the United States the year after. Years of development, a world-first transmission, an entirely new category that Honda had invented from scratch. The company had spent 3 years taking it from concept bike to showroom. It had told the press this was the future, and now it was finally real, sitting on the floor with a key in it. This was Honda planting its flag on the future of riding and inviting everyone to come along. And for a moment, it really did feel like a landmark. And then people looked at the price. In America, the first quoted price was around $14,599, and before long it was closer to $15,600. That was serious money. Cycle World pointed out that the DN01 cost about as much as Honda's own ST1300, a big, fully sorted sport tourer, while Kawasaki's much faster Concours 14 actually cost less. You were paying a real premium, and you weren't paying it for speed or for power. You were paying it for the gearbox and the styling. And in Britain, the numbers were just as awkward. At around 9,300 pounds, the DN01 cost roughly half as much again as Honda's own, similarly powered Transalp. For most riders, on either side of the Atlantic, that math just didn't add up, and Honda had walked straight into a trap. The problem wasn't that the technology let you down once you rode it, just the opposite. Reviewers generally loved how the DN01 worked, praising how smoothly the whole package came together on the road. The real problem was convincing anyone to hand over $15,000 just to find that out. Standing in the showroom, what a buyer could feel was the price, and sitting right next to it, 100 more conventional motorcycles that went faster, carried more, and cost thousands less. If you're into this kind of story, take a second to subscribe, because this whole channel is really a running history of the strange, brilliant, and occasionally disastrous machines that shaped modern motorcycling, and there is a lot more of it coming. Now back to the DN01, because the price was only its first problem. And here's the strange thing. Once people actually rode it, the DN01 turned out to handle far better than you'd expect from the spec sheet. It was long, with a wheelbase over 60 inches and close to 600 pounds ready to ride. But the seat sat low, the weight sat low, and testers kept being surprised by how easy it was to manage. One American review flat out called it a superb city bike that steered far better than its size had any right to. Where the compromise showed up was when you pushed it. The laid-back, feet-forward riding position didn't invite hard cornering, and the floorboards would scrape long before you ran out of nerve. So it landed in an awkward middle, not quite a relaxed cruiser, and not quite a sharp sports bike. But the deeper problem was simpler than any of that. Nobody seemed entirely sure who it was for. A newcomer might love the easy transmission and then choke on the $15,000 price. An experienced rider could easily afford it, but already knew how to use a clutch and had a huge choice of faster, more practical bikes for the same money. Honda had built something clever and genuinely likable, and then struggled to point at the person who was actually supposed to buy it. Then came the practical side, and this is where it really fell apart. This was a bike Honda pitched for comfortable, civilized riding, and yet it had essentially no luggage space at all. Nowhere to stash a bag, a lock, or a spare pair of gloves. On top of that, the wind protection at speed was poor, so any longer ride got tiring fast. For a machine that cost as much as a car and sold itself on being easy and relaxing, those were strange, almost unforgivable gaps. Put it all together, and you get one of the quietest disasters in modern Honda history. The DN001 found very few buyers. Production ended by 2010, after only a very short run. And this next detail really tells the whole story. Brand new, unsold DN01s were still sitting in dealerships years later, quietly waiting for someone to want them. Honda had built something ahead of its moment, and then watched the moment refuse to arrive. You can almost feel the frustration from Honda's side of it. They had solved a genuinely hard engineering problem. They had built the smooth, clutchless big bike they'd been chasing since 1962, and the market just shrugged. If the story ended right there, the DN01 would be nothing more than a cautionary tale about clever engineers getting ahead of their own customers. But it doesn't end there, because at almost the exact moment the DN01 was dying, Honda was quietly proving that the idea underneath it had been right all along. And this is the twist that reframes the entire thing. Honda didn't sit back and wait for the DN01 to fail before trying again. While the DN01 was still brand new on the showroom floor, Honda was already developing a completely different answer to the very same problem. That answer is called DCT, or dual clutch transmission, and it's worth being clear that it is not the same thing as the DN01's HFT. The HFT was that hydraulic mechanical CVT. DCT works much more like the quick automatics in high-end sports cars, using two separate clutches that hand off between the gears so smoothly you barely feel the shift. Honda first previewed it at the Milan Motorcycle Show in 2008, the very same year the DN01 went on sale, made it official the following year, and in 2010 fitted the world's first motorcycle dual-clutch transmission to a sport tourer called the VFR 1200F. At first, plenty of riders were skeptical, the very same instinct that had sunk the DN01. An automatic on a real motorcycle? But this time, Honda got the packaging right. It didn't bury the technology inside a strange, expensive, storage-free crossover. It offered DCT as an option on normal, desirable, sensibly priced bikes. In 2012, it pushed the system down into the more affordable NC700 range, specifically to put it under as many riders as possible, and from there it climbed steadily up the lineup. And the pitch was simple and honest. No stalling, smoother gear changes, less fatigue at the end of a long day, and you could still grab control and shift for yourself whenever you wanted to. And it worked. Today, you can get Honda's automatic on some of its most popular machines, like the Goldwing, the Africa Twin, the NC750X, the Rebel 1100, and the XADV. Riders didn't just tolerate it either, they chose it in huge numbers. By 2019, across Europe, 45% of Africa Twins, 52% of NC750X motorcycles, and a striking 67% of Goldwings were sold with the automatic instead of the manual, and Honda had passed 140,000 DCT bikes sold in Europe alone. It wasn't only a European thing either. Over in the United States, Honda reported that in the year to 2020, roughly 57% of Goldwings sold were the automatic. The exact idea the DN01 had been laughed at for, an automatic on a serious motorcycle, had quietly become normal, and on some of those bikes, it had even become the default. So what was the DN01 really? Not a failure of engineering. Honda's automatic did just about everything it promised. What sank it was price, positioning, and practicality, wrapped around technology the market hadn't yet learned to want. And it's worth stressing that DCT and the DN01 were separate projects. Honda developed the two transmissions along completely different paths. What they shared was a much older obsession, one that runs all the way back through the Super Cub and the Juno. Take the clutch work away from the rider without killing the direct, connected feel that makes a motorcycle fun. In that long pursuit, the DN01 was ultimately a dead end. It was DCT that finally reached ordinary riders. There's a strange, almost poetic ending to it too. For years, those unloved DN01s were the punchline, and used prices fell through the floor, dropping well below £5,000 in the UK, a fraction of what they had cost new. But lately, something has shifted. Riders have started to notice that the DN01 really was unlike anything before or since, a genuine world first and a proper piece of motorcycle history. Prices have steadied, and in some markets even ticked up again. And the bike everyone once laughed at has picked up a small but real cult following. Some enthusiasts now talk about it as a future classic. The machine that was too strange and too early to sell in 2008 has slowly become something a certain kind of rider goes looking for. A smooth, clutchless, genuinely odd Honda that was chasing a future the rest of the world simply hadn't reached yet. And maybe that's the most Honda thing about this entire story. After all, this whole company grew out of a wooden shack, built up by Soichiro Honda, a self-taught mechanic who spent his whole life convinced that the accepted way of doing things was usually just the way nobody had bothered to improve yet. The DN01 sold badly, and it cost Honda a little bit of face, and it joined the Juno in that quiet drawer of brilliant Honda ideas the world showed up too late to buy. But it came from the exact same instinct that built the Super Cub, and that eventually built the automatic bikes selling by the tens of thousands today. Sometimes being right and being early turn out to be the very same mistake. If you want the other side of that coin, the Honda idea that arrived at precisely the right moment and quietly put the whole world on two wheels, that story is waiting for you right here.